I got served divorce papers in my own parking lot, on a Tuesday, by a man who couldn't tell me himself. That's the whole story, really, if you want the short version. 12 years of building something with my hands, my name conspicuously absent from every document that mattered, and it ended with a stranger in a golf shirt asking me to confirm my identity before he handed me a manila envelope like he was delivering a pizza. I signed for it. I actually signed for it, because some old habit of politeness in me hadn't caught up yet with what was happening. Then I stood there in the parking lot of Cross and Row Home, the company I had spent a third of my life building, and I watched him drive away in a car that had my fingerprints all over its origin story, even if my name was nowhere on the title. My name is Elena Marsh. I go by Cross now, or I did, for 12 years, because that's what you do when you marry someone and decide to build a life instead of a resume. I was a trademark and licensing attorney before I met Richard. Good at it, too, the kind of good that gets you noticed early and promoted fast. I gave that up, not because he asked me to, not exactly, but because when we started talking about turning his scrappy little idea for a home goods line into something real, it made more sense for one of us to go all in. He had the vision, or so he said at the time, and I had the skill set to make vision survive contact with the actual world. Contracts. Licensing deals. Manufacturing relationships that took 18 months to build and could collapse in a phone call if you didn't know what you were doing. I knew what I was doing. I had always known what I was doing. For 12 years I was the reason Cross and Row Home existed as anything other than a nice idea Richard had over drinks with his college roommate. I negotiated our first retail placement. I structured the licensing deal that got our product line into 1,400 stores. I sat across from manufacturers in 3 different countries and got us terms that kept us solvent during 2 recessions and 1 pandemic. I did all of this as Richard's wife, not as an employee, not as a partner, not as anything with a title or a paycheck or a piece of paper that said this woman built half of what you're looking at. I did it because he asked me to trust him, and because I did, and because for a long time trusting him seemed to be working out fine for both of us. I should tell you about the parking lot again, because I keep circling back to it, and I think that's because it's the moment I can point to and say, here, this is where the floor changed under my feet. But if I'm honest with you, and I've decided I'm going to be honest with you for the rest of this, the floor had been shifting for a while before that. I just hadn't let myself feel it move. It started, or at least it started becoming visible to me, about 8 months earlier, with Brooke. Brooke Holloway was 29 years old when she came on as Richard's executive assistant, sharp, competent, the kind of hire that makes everyone around the office visibly relax because finally someone's going to keep the calendar straight. I liked her, at first. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easier for me to tell you I saw something coming and I didn't, not really. I saw a talented young woman getting more responsibility than her title suggested, and I thought, good for her. Good for Richard for recognizing talent, good for the company. I have thought a lot, since then, about how easy it is to read the early chapters of a betrayal as a success story if you're not looking for the right details. The details started stacking up slowly. Meetings I used to be looped into that I stopped hearing about until after they'd happened. Brooke sitting in on calls with our manufacturing partners in Vietnam, calls that used to be mine exclusively. Calls where the terms I'd spent years calibrating started shifting in ways nobody consulted me on. Richard staying late more often, which I told myself was just the launch season, because we had a launch season every year and every year he stayed late, and I had learned a long time ago not to read too much into the ordinary rhythms of a demanding business. But there's a difference between the ordinary rhythms of a business and the sound of a door quietly closing, and somewhere in those 8 months I started to hear it, even if I wouldn't let myself name it out loud. Richard started referring to himself in meetings using language he'd never used before. My company. My decision. My vision for where we're headed. 12 years of we had quietly become 12 years of my, and I don't think he even noticed himself doing it, which somehow made it worse. It meant the erasure wasn't a plan. It was a habit he'd already fully absorbed. Our son Theo noticed before I let myself admit it too. He's 22, sharp the way his father used to be before ambition curdled into something colder, and he came home from college over spring break and asked me, almost offhand, if Dad's assistant was coming to family dinner again this week. I asked him what he meant by again, and he shrugged in that particular way 22-year-olds shrug when they've said more than they meant to, and told me Brooke had been at 2 dinners the last time he was home and he'd assumed I knew. I did not know. I want to tell you I confronted Richard that night, that I demanded answers and got them, that this story has the shape of a woman who saw the danger clearly and moved to protect herself immediately. That's not what happened. What happened is I asked him about it, carefully, the way you ask a question when you're afraid of what the honest answer might cost you, and he told me Brooke had been helping him prep for the retail expansion and it made sense to loop her into some of the more social obligations since she understood the account relationships better than most of the executive team. He said it so smoothly, so reasonably, that I believed him, or at least I let myself believe I believed him, because the alternative was a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I think about that a lot now. How much of what happened to me was Richard's doing, and how much was my own long practice of choosing the version of events that let me keep going? I don't say that to blame myself. I say it because I think it's important, if you're listening to this and you've ever caught yourself doing the same thing, to understand that noticing the pattern is not the same as being naive. It's just what happens when you've built your whole adult life around trusting one person completely, and pulling that trust apart takes longer than pulling apart anything else. The moment it stopped being deniable was Theo's graduation. I flew out 3 days early to help him find an apartment near his first job, the kind of trip that should have been purely happy, and it mostly was, until the ceremony itself, until I was sitting in the second row of folding chairs on a lawn that smelled like fresh cut grass and cheap sunscreen, waiting for Richard to arrive from the airport, and I turned around because I heard his voice, and there he was, walking up the aisle of chairs with Brooke Holloway on his arm, dressed like she belonged there, smiling at people she didn't know like she'd been rehearsing the smile in the car. I want to describe what that felt like, but honestly, the feeling itself is almost beside the point. What I remember most clearly is the calculation happening behind my own eyes even as my chest went cold, the fast, cold arithmetic of a woman who has spent 12 years reading contracts for a living. I remember thinking, with a kind of detachment that surprised me even at the time, that a man does not bring his mistress to his son's graduation unless he has already stopped being afraid of the consequences. Unless he has already decided the marriage is over and simply hasn't told his wife yet. He hadn't told me yet. He told me 3 weeks later, in the parking lot, through a man in a golf shirt holding a clipboard. I signed for the envelope because refusing wouldn't have changed what was inside it. I stood there afterward, in the same parking lot where I used to arrive early on launch days with coffee for the whole team, where I used to sit in my car on hard weeks and give myself 5 minutes to fall apart before walking in and being fine, and I watched Richard's car pull out of the lot without him ever once looking back at me through the windshield. I went inside anyway. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some part of me still believed the building itself remembered what I'd done for it, even if the man who ran it had decided to forget. My badge didn't work. I stood at the door of an office I had walked through 5 days a week for over a decade, holding a manila envelope with my own name on it in a font I didn't recognize, and I could not get inside. That's when I understood, standing there, holding a divorce filing in one hand and pressing a badge that no longer meant anything against a reader that no longer recognized me, that whatever came next was going to require something from me that being reasonable never had. I had spent 12 years being the quiet architecture underneath someone else's name on the building. I had signed nothing that said the work was mine, because I had trusted the man I was doing it for. But I hadn't signed everything away. Not everything. There was a filing cabinet, back in the very earliest days of this company, before we had lawyers on retainer, before we had an LLC properly set up, before Richard had learned to say my company instead of ours. There was a set of trademark registrations I had filed myself, in a hurry, using my own name, my maiden name, Elena Marsh, because at the time we didn't have the paperwork sorted for the business entity yet and someone needed to protect the name and the logo before we lost the window. I remember filing them. I remember thinking, we'll transfer these once the LLC is finalized, and then the LLC got finalized, and 100 other urgent things happened, And somewhere in the chaos of building an actual company out of an idea, that one piece of paperwork simply never got revisited. 12 years is a long time for no one to notice a mistake like that. I didn't know yet, standing in that parking lot with a locked door in front of me and a stranger's clipboard signature still drying on an envelope, exactly what I was going to do with what I remembered. But I knew, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, that I wasn't going to spend the next however many months waiting for someone else to decide what happened to me next. I got in my car. I didn't cry, not yet, not in the parking lot, because crying felt like something I could schedule for later, and there was somewhere I needed to be first. There was a storage unit 40 minutes from that office, full of bankers' boxes I hadn't opened in years, boxes I'd kept out of some instinct I didn't fully understand until that exact moment, sitting in my car with the engine running, staring at a building that no longer let me in. I put the car in drive. If Richard thought erasing me from the building meant erasing me from what we'd built, he was about to learn something about paperwork that even his lawyers hadn't thought to check. The storage unit door came up loud, that metal rattle that always sounds louder than it should in an empty hallway, and I stood there for a second before I made myself walk in, because some part of me still expected the boxes to look different than I remembered. They didn't. Same handwriting on the labels, my handwriting, younger and looser than it is now, the kind of handwriting a woman has before she spends a decade signing things carefully so no one can say she wasn't precise. I didn't open anything that night. I just stood in that narrow concrete room surrounded by 12 years of paperwork nobody else remembered existed, and I let myself cry for the first time since the parking lot, quietly, the way you cry when you're trying not to disturb boxes. I want to tell you the weeks that followed had some kind of momentum to them, some clean narrative arc where I discovered my power and started using it immediately, but that's not how it went. What actually happened is that the machinery of divorce is slow and grinding and built, I think deliberately, to exhaust you before you ever get anywhere close to fighting back. Richard's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Vance who had a voice like a closing door, sent over a settlement proposal 11 days after I was served. I read it twice before I understood what I was looking at, and then I read it a third time because I didn't want to believe I'd understood it correctly the first two. The proposal described me, in language so careful it had clearly been drafted with future litigation in mind, as a supportive spouse. Not a business partner. Not an unpaid executive. Not the woman who had negotiated the retail deal that put Cross and Row home in 1,400 stores. A supportive spouse, the kind of phrase you'd use for someone who hosted dinner parties and picked out office furniture, and based on that framing, the offer on the table was a fraction of what I would have expected even under the most conservative division of assets. No equity in the company. Minimal alimony, time limited, structured to taper off in 5 years as though I'd simply need a brief transitional stipend before returning to some career I'd apparently just been on a long pause from. And buried in section 14, so far down that I think they were hoping I'd stop reading before I got there, a non-disparagement clause so broad it would have legally prevented me from ever discussing my role at the company again, publicly or privately, for the rest of my life. I sat with that document open on my kitchen table for a long time. 12 years, reduced to a sentence about spousal support, with a gag order attached so I couldn't even correct the record. The accounts froze 2 days after that. This is standard in divorce proceedings, I know that now, I knew it then too in the abstract legal sense, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it happen to your own checking account are two very different experiences. I watched the balance freeze mid-transaction while I was trying to pay a contractor for work on the house, watched the little red error message pop up on my banking app, and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the particular humiliation of being made suddenly, administratively small. I called Richard. I want to be honest and tell you I called him hoping for an explanation that made this feel less deliberate, less like something aimed directly at me, and what I got instead was 3 rings and then his voicemail, the same recorded greeting he'd had for years, my husband's voice cheerfully asking me to leave a message after the tone as though nothing between us had changed at all. I didn't leave one. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot, because I'd been on my way to buy groceries when the transaction failed, and I let the silence on the other end of that call tell me everything his lawyer's careful language had already made clear. He wasn't going to explain himself. He wasn't going to soften anything. He had moved on to treating me like an obstacle, and obstacles don't get phone calls returned. The advisory call stopped the following week, not with an announcement, just with silence, an invitation that used to arrive every Thursday morning simply not showing up in my inbox anymore. I found out 3 days later, when a former colleague mentioned in passing that they'd covered the Q3 retail numbers on Thursday's call, and I had to sit very still and pretend I already knew that, because admitting I hadn't been invited felt like admitting something was true that I still wasn't ready to say out loud. I think the accounts and the settlement offer and the disappearing meetings would have been enough on their own to count as rock bottom, honestly. But the part that actually broke something open in me, the part one still think about more than any of the financial maneuvering, was Theo. He called me on a Sunday, the way he usually did, and I was glad to hear from him, genuinely glad, because in the middle of everything else my son's voice on the phone had become one of the only things that still felt uncomplicated. We talked about his apartment, his new job, ordinary things, and then he mentioned, carefully, in the tone of someone testing whether he already suspects is bad, that his dad had told him I was being difficult about the settlement. Difficult. That was the word Richard had used, apparently, to his own son, about the woman who had spent 12 years building the company that was paying for that apartment and that new job. I asked Theo what he meant, and he said, not unkindly, that his dad had explained the offer was more than fair given that I hadn't technically worked for the company, and that dragging things out was just going to hurt everyone, including him, since apparently legal fees were eating into the family's finances during a critical growth period for the business. I sat there listening to my son repeat his father's talking points back to me in a voice that still had some of its childhood softness in it, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that Richard wasn't just rewriting the story for lawyers and business partners. He was rewriting it for our son. He was making sure that even if I fought back, even if I somehow won, the person I loved most in the world had already been given a version of events where I was the unreasonable one, the difficult one, the woman standing in the way of everyone else's peace. I didn't argue with Theo. I want you to understand why, because I've thought about it a lot since. I could have laid out the whole truth right there on the phone, could have told him about the trademark filings, could have told him what 1,400 retail placements actually take to negotiate, could have made him understand in one conversation everything his father had spent months quietly erasing. But he was 22, and he loved his father, and I didn't want the first real conversation about what was happening to be one where I forced him to choose a side using facts he wasn't ready to weigh fairly yet. So I told him I loved him, and that things were complicated, and that I'd explain more when there was more to explain. He said okay, in a voice that told me he wasn't sure he believed there was more to explain. That hurt worse than the frozen accounts. Worse than the settlement offer. Worse, almost, than Brooke's arm through Richard's at the graduation. After that call I drove back to the storage unit. I don't know why. I think I needed to be somewhere that hadn't been touched by any of it, somewhere Richard's version of the story hadn't reached yet, and a 10 by 10 concrete room full of my own handwriting was the only place I could think of that qualified. I sat down on the concrete floor, because I didn't trust myself to stand for long, and I looked at all those boxes stacked against the wall, 12 years of my own labor sitting in cardboard, unlabeled in any way that would mean anything to a stranger, meaningful only to me. I thought about the settlement offer sitting on my kitchen table, calling 12 years a supportive spousal role. I thought about my accounts, frozen mid-transaction. I thought about my son's voice, careful and a little cold, repeating his father's version of who I was. And I thought, sitting there in that unglamorous concrete room with my knees pulled up to my chest like I was 25 again instead of 44, that nobody was coming to fix this for me. Not a lawyer I hadn't hired yet. Not a friend who could intervene on my behalf. Not even Theo, not yet, not until I gave him a reason to look past what his father had told him. If something in this situation was going to change, if I was going to stop being the supportive spouse in someone else's carefully worded settlement offer, it was going to be because I made it change, using whatever was actually mine, whatever nobody had thought to take because nobody had thought to remember it existed in the first place. I looked at the boxes again, differently this time. Not as sentimental clutter I'd been too sentimental to throw away. as evidence. As 12 years of paperwork that had my name on it in ways Richard's lawyer clearly hadn't checked, because if she had, Section 14 of that settlement offer would have looked very different. I didn't open a single box that night. I wasn't ready yet, not really, still too raw from the phone call with Theo, still feeling the particular ache of being called difficult by the person you love most for the crime of noticing you were being erased. But I sat there until the automatic lights in the hallway clicked off and back on twice, and by the time I finally stood up and drove home, something in me had shifted from grief into something quieter and steadier, something that felt less like falling and more like bracing. I still didn't know exactly what I was going to find in those boxes. But I knew, driving home in the dark with the settlement offer still sitting unanswered on my kitchen table, that I was done waiting to find out what Richard's version of my life was going to cost me. Whatever those boxes held, I was going to use every page of it. I called Sandra Whitmore on a Monday morning, which felt appropriate somehow, because Sandra was the kind of woman who had never once in the 30 years I'd known her tolerated nonsense past a weekend. She'd been my mentor in law school, the professor who told me on my first day of trademark law that the whole field was really just the art of proving who got there first, and she'd stayed in my life in that quiet, occasional way good mentors do, a phone call every year or two, a note when I passed the bar, a longer silence during the years I'd stepped back from practicing law to build someone else's company instead. She didn't ask me why I was calling after 4 years of silence. She just asked me what I needed, and something about the bluntness of that question, the total absence of pity in it, made it easier to answer honestly than it had been with almost anyone else since the parking lot. I told her I needed to get reinstated with the state bar. I told her I had let my license go inactive years ago, back when Cross and Row Home had needed all of me and none of my old career had room to exist alongside it, and now I needed to be a lawyer again, properly, on paper, as fast as the process would allow. She didn't ask why. She just told me what forms I'd need, which continuing education credits I'd have to make up, and how long the whole thing usually took if you pushed it. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "Elena, the version of you I taught was never actually gone. She was just working a different case." I spent the next several weeks doing 2 things at once, and I want to describe both of them clearly, because I think it's easy to romanticize a comeback and skip over the unglamorous machinery underneath it. The first thing was the bar reinstatement itself, which meant online coursework at 11 at night after a full day of divorce logistics, meant driving 2 hours to sit an ethics exam in a fluorescent-lit testing center alongside 22-year-olds fresh out of law school, meant waiting anxiously for an official letter that would either tell me I was allowed to practice law again or tell me to start the whole process over. It came through in the 4th week. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that letter, feeling something unlock in my chest that I hadn't felt in over a decade, the particular, specific relief of being handed back a version of yourself you'd quietly assumed was gone for good. The second thing I was doing, running alongside the bar reinstatement like a parallel track, was going through the boxes. I want to tell you it happened in one dramatic night, papers scattered everywhere, a single perfect document catching the light at exactly the right moment. It didn't happen like that. It happened in small, unglamorous increments, an hour here after work, a Saturday afternoon there, going through boxes that were mostly, honestly, disappointing. Old expense reports. Draft contracts that never got signed. A folder of birthday cards from employees who'd since moved on to other companies, which I hadn't expected to find and which cost me an unplanned 20 minutes of sitting on the concrete floor remembering people I hadn't thought about in years. It was in the 11th box, a box labeled in my own younger handwriting simply as early filings, that I found what I didn't yet know I was looking for. It was a manila folder, slightly yellowed at the edges, containing copies of trademark registration filings from our 2nd year in business, back when Cross and Row Home was still operating out of a rented office above a dry cleaner and Richard and I were doing the work of 6 people between the 2 of us. I remembered filing these. I remembered the specific week, actually, because it had coincided with a manufacturing deadline that had nearly sunk us, and I remembered thinking, distinctly, we need to protect the name and the logo before someone else does, and we don't have the LLC paperwork finalized yet, so I'll just file these under my own name for now and we'll transfer everything once the entity structure is sorted. we never sorted it. Or rather, I never circled back to it, because 6 months later we did finalize the LLC, and there were 100 more urgent things demanding attention, and somewhere in the chaos of an actual growing business, one small piece of unfinished paperwork simply slipped through a crack that never got noticed again. Not by me, because I forgot, genuinely forgot, the way you forget almost anything when life moves fast enough. And not by Richard, I'm fairly certain, because trademark filings were never his part of the business. They were mine. He wouldn't have thought to check them any more than I would have thought to check his manufacturing contracts. I sat on that concrete floor with the folder open in my lap and read through it 3 times before I let myself believe what I was looking at. The original trademark registration for the cross and row home name. The logo, the specific typeface and color mark we'd used since the beginning, the one now printed on packaging in 1,400 stores. 3 of our earliest and most successful product line names, the ones that had become, over a decade, essentially synonymous with the brand itself. All of it, filed under Elena Marsh. My maiden name. My name, alone, with no mention of Richard, no mention of any business entity, no mention of anyone but the woman who'd sat in a rented office above a dry cleaner and done the unglamorous work of protecting something before it was worth protecting. I called Marcus that same night. Marcus Delgado had been a colleague of mine at my old firm, years ago, before Cross and Row Home existed at all, back when we were both junior associates working brutal hours and finding each other in the break room at 2 in the morning over bad coffee and shared exhaustion. We'd been close then, close in the specific way that intense, formative professional friendships can be, the kind where someone sees you at your least composed and somehow that becomes the foundation of real respect instead of embarrassment. He'd gone into intellectual property litigation. I'd gone, eventually, into building someone else's company instead of practicing law at all. We'd stayed loosely in touch over the years, a message here, a congratulations there, the kind of friendship that survives on goodwill even when the actual contact is sparse. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me, given the hour, and when I explained what I'd found, there was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause I recognized immediately as a lawyer's mind working faster than his mouth could keep up with. He asked me to send him the documents. I did, right there, photographing each page with my phone with hands that weren't entirely steady. He called me back 40 minutes later, and his voice had a different quality to it than it had earlier, something careful and precise and, underneath the carefulness, unmistakably energized. He told me the filings were still active. Trademark registrations require periodic renewal, he explained, and normally, if a company were operating properly, someone would have caught an ownership discrepancy like this within the first renewal cycle and corrected it, transferred the marks into the LLC's name the way they should have been transferred from the beginning. But Cross and Row Home, in its early scrappy years, had apparently handled its trademark renewals through an outside filing service that simply processed the paperwork on autopilot, renewing whatever name was already on file without flagging any discrepancy, because why would they? Nobody had ever told them to look for one. 12 years of automatic renewals, filed under a name Richard had stopped associating with the company as soon as I stopped using it socially. 12 years of nobody checking, because checking would have meant someone at Cross and Row Home doubting a piece of the foundation they'd built everything else on top of. Marcus told me, in the careful, precise language of a man who did not want to overpromise something this significant, that if the filings were as clean as they appeared, I did not merely have a claim to some portion of the company's value. I owned, outright, the intellectual property the entire company was built on. The name. The logo. The 3 signature product lines that made up the majority of their revenue. Richard could keep operating Cross and Row Home only with my ongoing permission, and legally, permission I hadn't yet given. I sat with that for a long moment, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think it's more complicated than the satisfying revenge fantasy version of this story would suggest. I didn't feel triumphant, not at first. I felt something closer to grief, actually, a strange delayed grief for the version of this marriage where I might have simply mentioned this to Richard years ago, in some easier season, and we'd have laughed about the oversight and fixed the paperwork together over dinner. That version of us didn't exist anymore, if it ever had. The man who brought his mistress to our son's graduation was not a man I owed the comfort of an easy correction. I asked Marcus what he thought I should do. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've held on to since. He said, "Elena, I've watched you build things for other people your entire career. I think it might finally be time to build something for yourself, and use everything you know how to do to make sure nobody mistakes what it cost you to build it." I didn't decide that night to burn anything down. I want to be clear about that, because what came after wasn't rage, not exactly, even though I had every right to rage. It was something steadier than that. I decided, sitting on that concrete floor with a folder of 12-year-old paperwork in my lap and Marcus's voice still warm in my ear from the phone call, that I was done being the supportive spouse in Richard's version of this story. I was done being difficult, in Theo's careful, borrowed phrasing. I was done waiting for someone else's settlement offer to define what 12 years of my life had been worth. I had the paperwork. I had my license back. I had a colleague who believed the work I'd done was real, was mine, was worth protecting properly this time. I picked up my phone and started drafting the cease and desist letter myself, right there on the concrete floor, because some part of me needed my own hands to be the ones that started this, not a lawyer's on my behalf, not yet. I would bring in the full legal machinery soon enough. But the first move was going to be mine, in my own words, because for 12 years my words had built a company nobody remembered belonged partly to me, and it felt important, necessary even, that the words that started taking it back were mine too. I sent the cease and desist letter on a Wednesday morning, and I remember the date specifically because I'd chosen it on purpose. Wednesdays, I knew from 12 years inside that building, were production confirmation days, the day the manufacturing team finalized packaging runs for anything scheduled to ship in the coming weeks. I wasn't trying to be cruel about the timing. I was trying to be precise, which is a different thing entirely, and precision was something I understood far better than cruelty ever came naturally to me. Marcus reviewed the letter before it went out, tightened 2 paragraphs, and told me the language was, in his words, exactly as sharp as it needed to be and not 1 degree sharper. It informed Cross and Row Home, formally, through their own legal counsel, that the trademarks covering the company name, the logo, and 3 of its signature product lines were registered to Elena Marsh, that no transfer of ownership had ever been executed, and that continued use of these marks in current and upcoming production runs, absent a licensing agreement, constituted infringement. It requested an immediate halt to any packaging or promotional materials currently in production bearing the marks in question. I found out later, from someone still inside the company who reached out to me quietly once the news started moving through the office, that the letter arrived while Richard was in a vendor call for the fall retail launch, the one they'd been building toward for months, the one that represented, by some estimates, nearly a third of the year's projected revenue. Production on the packaging had already begun. 6 figures of inventory sat mid-manufacture in a facility in Ohio, cartons half printed with a logo that, as of that Wednesday morning, Richard no longer had clear legal right to use. I want to tell you I felt triumphant hearing that. What I actually felt, sitting in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, was something quieter and stranger, a kind of recognition, like watching a door I had built years ago finally swing open on hinges nobody remembered installing. The second win came 10 days later, and this one required a different kind of care, because it involved a person rather than a piece of paper. Diane Okafor was the senior buyer at Halloran & Fitch, our largest retail account, the relationship I had personally built over 3 years of careful, patient negotiation back when we were still small enough that losing one account could have sunk us. Diane and I had never been close exactly, but we had a genuine professional respect between us, built on years of me never once overpromising her something Cross and Row Home couldn't deliver. I called her, not to weaponize the relationship exactly, but because I owed her, professionally, the truth before she found out secondhand through industry gossip that something had shifted with a vendor she was preparing to feature prominently in her fall retail plan. I told her only what was true and only what was necessary. That there was an active dispute over trademark ownership at Cross and Row Home. That I couldn't speak to the specifics given ongoing legal proceedings. That I thought, as someone who respected her enough to give her real information instead of letting her walk into a launch that might be disrupted midstream, She should know there was risk here before her team committed further shelf space and marketing spend to the fall rollout. I didn't ask her to delay anything. I didn't need to. Diane had built her career on exactly the kind of caution that made her good at her job, and a single phone call from a woman she'd trusted for years, delivering careful, limited, but unmistakably serious information, was enough. Halloran and Fitch quietly pushed the launch date back 6 weeks, citing internal planning adjustments in the official communication to Cross and row home, though I suspect everyone involved understood exactly what had actually happened. The third win, I didn't engineer at all. It simply happened, the way consequences tend to happen once you stop absorbing them yourself and let them land where they were always going to land. Brooke Holloway, now officially Vice President of Brand, 6 months into a promotion that had been announced with considerably more confidence than the company currently possessed, was the one who had to stand in front of the board and explain why the fall launch had been delayed, why 6 figures of inventory sat frozen mid-production, why their largest retail account had quietly pulled back its commitment. I wasn't in that room, obviously. I hadn't set foot in that building since my badge stopped working. But I heard about it, in pieces, from people who still talked to people who'd been there, and the picture that emerged was not a flattering one for Brooke. She had been promoted specifically because Richard wanted a brand story that looked forward, unburdened, uncomplicated by 12 years of someone else's careful, patient labor. What she got instead, 6 months into the job, was the task of explaining a crisis she had no context to understand, rooted in a piece of history nobody had told her about, because nobody had told her the woman she'd replaced still legally owned the ground the company was standing on. I don't take pleasure in imagining that meeting exactly. But I won't pretend I felt nothing either, some complicated mixture of vindication and a strange, unexpected pity for a 29-year-old who had walked into a story already halfway written by 2 people she barely understood. The fourth one arrived quietly, almost administratively, the way the most significant developments sometimes do. Patricia Vance, Richard's lawyer, the one whose careful language had once described 12 years of my labor as merely supportive, sent over a revised settlement proposal. I hadn't filed a formal counteroffer yet. Marcus and I were still building the full case, still documenting everything properly before making our first real move. But the revised numbers on the table were substantially higher than the original offer, the non-disparagement clause quietly narrowed to something far more reasonable, the alimony structure extended without the sharp 5-year taper that had originally been designed to push me back into financial precarity just as I was rebuilding my footing. Richard's own legal team, I realized, reading through the revision, had done the math themselves. They understood, better than Richard apparently did, what it would cost the company if this dispute became public, if retailers started asking pointed questions about ownership stability, if the story of a woman erased from 12 years of her own work started circulating in industry circles where reputation moved faster than any legal proceeding could. They were trying to make this go away quietly, cheaply, before it became something they couldn't control. I didn't celebrate any of these wins the way you might expect, not with any real sense of victory lap. Each one cost me something too, in a different currency than money. The cease and desist letter cost me a sleepless night worrying about the employees still working at that company, people I'd hired myself years ago, people who had nothing to do with what Richard had done and everything to lose if the disruption spiraled further than I intended. The conversation with Diane cost me the last thread of pretending this could stay purely private, purely personal, contained within the walls of a marriage instead of bleeding into an industry I still cared about. Even Brooke's difficult board meeting, which I hadn't engineered and felt no responsibility for, cost me a small, uncomfortable piece of my own certainty about who deserved sympathy in this story and who didn't. But underneath all of it, something else was happening too, something I hadn't expected and wasn't fully prepared for. Marcus and I had been talking almost daily by this point, ostensibly about the case, timelines, and filings and strategy calls that ran later into the evening than strictly necessary. I noticed, somewhere in the second week of this new rhythm, that I was looking forward to those calls in a way that had nothing to do with trademark law. He had a particular way of listening, actually listening, pausing before he responded instead of already composing his next point while I was still talking, and I realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that I hadn't experienced that specific quality of attention in longer than I wanted to admit. We hadn't said anything to each other, not directly, not yet. But there was a call, late on a Thursday night, after we'd finished going through a particularly dense set of documents, where the conversation drifted, unplanned, into something more personal. He asked me how I was actually doing, not how the case was going, and something about the specificity of that question, the way he separated my well-being from my strategy, undid something careful in my chest that I'd been holding tight for months. I told him the truth, more of it than I'd told almost anyone, about the loneliness underneath the vindication, about how strange it was to feel powerful and unmoored in the exact same week. He didn't try to fix it. He just said, quietly, that he'd noticed, over the years, that I had a habit of being extraordinary on other people's behalf and almost invisible on my own, and that he hoped whatever came next for me included some version of being seen properly, finally, by someone who'd actually been paying attention all along. I didn't know what to do with that, sitting alone in my kitchen at 11 at night with case files spread across the table. I just knew I didn't want the call to end, and that when it finally did, I sat there for a long time afterward, feeling something unfamiliar and cautiously warm settle into a space that had been cold for a very long while. I had 4 wins now, each one costing Richard something specific he valued: inventory, retail confidence, a promotion he'd staked his credibility on, leverage he no longer fully controlled. I had my license back. I had a folder of paperwork that proved 12 years hadn't been supportive labor but ownership, plain and documented, and mine. And, quietly, unexpectedly, underneath all of it, I had the first real warmth I'd felt from another person in longer than I wanted to admit. Not offered as rescue, but as recognition. I still didn't know everything Richard had done, or how far this pattern of his actually went. I was about to find out it went back much further than I ever expected. I found the second folder by accident, the way most of the truly important discoveries in this whole ordeal seemed to arrive, not through some dramatic pursuit but through the quiet, unglamorous work of double-checking my own paperwork before filing anything formally with the court. Marcus had asked me to pull the complete registration history on the trademarks, every renewal, every filing service transaction, everything, so we could present the court with an unbroken chain of ownership that left no room for Richard's lawyers to argue confusion or oversight. I went back to the storage unit for what I told myself would be the last time, back to the same concrete room that had become, over these past months, something closer to a second office than a place I stored old boxes. The registration history search meant pulling records not just from our filing service but from the state trademark database itself, cross-referencing names, dates, entity numbers. I was looking for our filings specifically: Elena Marsh, Cross and Row Home, the years I already knew by heart. What I found instead, sitting a few entries above ours in the database, filed under a different business name entirely, was a trademark registration from 9 years before I ever met Richard, for a company called Whitfield and Cross Design Studio, filed under the name Dana Whitfield. I sat very still in front of my laptop for a long moment, reading that name over and over, because I understood immediately what I was looking at even before I let myself fully believe it. Richard had been married before me. I knew that, in the vague, unexamined way you know facts about a spouse's past that never seemed relevant enough to dig into. A first marriage, brief, before my time, something he'd mentioned early in our relationship with the practiced casualness of a man who wanted the subject closed as quickly as it was opened. I'd never asked for details. I hadn't seen a reason to. I saw a reason now. The filing pattern was almost identical to ours. A design studio, co-founded, the trademarks filed under Dana's name during an early scramble before the business entity was properly structured, the same story, the same gap, the same quiet assumption that the paperwork would get sorted later. Except later, for Dana, apparently never came either, and at some point the business had dissolved, the trademarks lapsed in used, and Dana Whitfield had simply disappeared from any record I could find connected to that company. I called Marcus immediately, and I could hear him go quiet on the other end of the line the same way he had the night I first found our own filings, that careful, precise stillness of a mind working faster than words could keep pace with. He told me to give him a day. He had contacts who could track down public records faster than I could on my own, and by the following evening he called back with a phone number and an address in a city 3 states away. I sat with that phone number for 2 full days before I called it. I want to be honest with you about why. Part of me was afraid of what I'd find, afraid Dana Whitfield would be some bitter, broken woman whose life had been permanently derailed by whatever happened between her and Richard, and I didn't know if I had room in me, on top of everything else, to carry someone else's decade-old grief alongside my own fresh wound. But a larger part of me understood that I owed her the call regardless of what I found on the other end of it, because if what I suspected was true, she deserved to know she hadn't been alone in this, even if the knowing came 9 years too late to change anything for her. Dana picked up on the 4th ring, and her voice was steady, careful in the particular way of someone who has learned not to be surprised by anything anymore. I introduced myself, told her I was Richard Cross's current wife, and there was a long pause before she said, quietly, almost like she'd been waiting 9 years for exactly this call, "Tell me what he did to you." We talked for 2 hours that night. She told me about Whitfield and Cross Design Studio, about building it from nothing alongside Richard in her late 20s, about handling the same kind of unglamorous foundational work I had handled, contracts and client relationships and the early trademark filings, done under her own name because the entity structure wasn't finalized yet and someone needed to protect the work. She told me about the slow erosion that followed, meetings she stopped being invited to, a junior designer who started appearing at client dinners with increasing regularity, and finally, a divorce filing that arrived while she was traveling for a client pitch, delivered to her hotel room by a courier instead of a conversation. She told me she'd never checked whether her trademark filings had been transferred, because by the time the divorce was finalized she was too exhausted and too broke to hire a lawyer capable of untangling it, and Richard's legal team, back then, had convinced her the business was worth less than her share of the marital debt, so she'd walked away from everything, including, unknowingly, the intellectual property that had actually been hers all along. She'd spent 9 years rebuilding a career from nothing, and she told me, in a voice that had gone very quiet by that point in the conversation, that hearing my story was the first time in nearly a decade she'd understood that what happened to her hadn't been a personal failure. It had been a method. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the two of us, a decade apart, sitting in different states, having built the exact same kind of foundational, uncredited labor for the exact same man, erased through the exact same pattern, right down to the courier delivering news that should have come as a conversation. I thought about how easy it would have been for Richard to simply keep doing this indefinitely, one marriage at a time, if 2 women hadn't happened to compare paperwork. Marcus and I decided, together, that the confrontation needed to happen properly, not as an ambush, not as theater, but as a plain, documented presentation of fact that left Richard nowhere to maneuver. Dana flew in the following week. Meeting her in person was strange in a way I hadn't fully prepared for. This woman who was, in some sense, a stranger, and in another sense, the only other person alive who understood exactly what the last year of my life had cost me. We didn't need to explain much to each other. We just recognized something in each other's eyes, some particular, familiar exhaustion, and it was enough. We met Richard in Marcus's conference room, not Richard's office, not neutral ground he could control. Marcus sat beside me with a folder of documentation thick enough that Richard's eyes went to it before they went to either of our faces. Dana sat on my other side, calm in a way I found genuinely remarkable given what this room must have cost her emotionally to walk into. Richard's practiced charm arrived first, the easy smile, the reasonable tone, already halfway into some explanation about how all of this had simply been an oversight, a paperwork technicality blown out of proportion by lawyers looking to run up billable hours. He got maybe 90 seconds into that performance before Marcus slid the folder across the table and asked him to explain, specifically, why the same paperwork technicality had happened twice, 9 years apart, to 2 different women, under circumstances that were, document for document, nearly identical. I watched something shift in Richard's face in that moment, watched the practiced charm falter because it had nothing left to work with. He looked at Dana properly for what I suspect was the first time in 9 years, and whatever he saw in her expression, calm and unflinching and utterly unsurprised by his attempt at deflection, seemed to finally register that this wasn't a negotiation he was going to talk his way out of. He didn't confess exactly, not in the dramatic sense you might expect from a story like this. He simply stopped arguing, which, from a man who had spent months arguing that 12 years of my labor amounted to supportive spousal behavior, was its own kind of confession. His own lawyer, Patricia Vance, sitting quietly beside him through the whole meeting, had gone very still the moment the second filing appeared on the table, and I understood, watching her face, that she was doing the same fast, cold calculation I'd done in that parking lot months earlier, understanding immediately what a documented pattern like this would mean if it ever became public. The settlement that followed happened fast, faster than either Marcus or I had expected. Richard agreed to a full buyout of my trademark interests at a fair, independently assessed value, agreed to alimony terms without the punitive taper his original offer had included, and agreed, critically, to release me from any non-disparagement obligation whatsoever. He wasn't protecting me by doing that. He was protecting himself, understanding that a public dispute now carried the risk of Dana's story surfacing alongside mine, and two women with matching documentation was a story no amount of charm could spin favorably. I relaunched under my own name 3 months later. Elena Marsh, licensing and brand consultant, with Dana as my first official business partner, the two of us building something together that neither of us had been permitted to build fully on our own the first time around. It felt less like revenge and more like correction, like finally finishing a sentence someone else had cut off years before either of us got to the important part. Theo came around slowly, the way I think most 22-year-olds do when the version of events they've been handed finally cracks open under the weight of documentation neither of us had needed to exaggerate. I didn't push him. I just kept being honest, and eventually he started asking better questions, and eventually those better questions led him to understanding, on his own timeline, who his mother had actually been all along. Marcus and I didn't rush anything either, which surprised me, given everything else in my life had happened at the accelerated pace of crisis and consequence. He showed up, weeks after the settlement closed, with case law printouts I didn't need anymore and coffee that was, as always, slightly too bitter, and he sat across from me at my kitchen table, not to discuss strategy this time, just to sit there, and I realized, watching him settle into a chair like he belonged there, that this was what being chosen by someone paying real attention actually felt like. Not a rescue. Not a replacement for everything I'd lost. Just steadiness, finally, offered by someone who had believed in the work I did back when the person I was married to never had. If you've made it this far with me, through all 5 chapters of this, I want to ask you something directly, the way Dana asked me something directly on the phone that first night. If any part of this story sounded familiar to you, if you've ever caught yourself doing unglamorous, uncredited labor for someone who quietly stopped saying we and started saying mine, I hope you'll consider staying close to this channel, subscribing if you haven't already, because these stories keep finding their way to me, and I have a feeling this isn't the last one worth telling. Dana mentioned something to me last month that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. A woman reached out to her recently, someone who knew Richard even before Dana did, years before Whitfield and Cross Design Studio ever existed, and according to Dana, the story this woman told sounded uncomfortably, specifically familiar. I don't know yet how far back this pattern actually goes. But I intend to find out, and when I do, you'll be the first to hear it.